Hello, everyone. How are y'all doing today? So, as always, these podcasts are completely off the cuff, and I don't script or edit anything. So, I will see what comes through. Today, though, the intention is to talk about shame and vulnerability, and what is, I guess, inspiring me to do this podcast today is the other day I wrote a very vulnerable post about my childhood, and specifically about my relationship to the father, to fathers, or to men. I guess I could even branch out into, and basically in a nutshell shared how, my father was a very messed up man. He had his own very abusive, traumatic childhood. And, unfortunately, as human beings, if we don't do the work, if we don't heal our wounds and our trauma, we replicate them. We hand them over to other people. And so, suffice it to say, he was, emotionally very abusive. He was physically very threatening. I mean, he was really not well, let's just say. Narcissistic, manipulative. And long story short, basically my mom and I and her, she had separated. She had basically escaped, to say the least, and was able to kind of separate from him. And then a little bit further down the road, when he was in prison, my mom and I and her then new partner, we fled the country, and we went from England to Italy for a little bit of time. So, but for me as a child, there had been no explanation as to what was happening. And so literally from, I had already been used to kind of going between my mom and dad for maybe a half a year, I'm not sure. And I had visceral memories of that. And I had visceral memories of recognizing that even at like 3 years old, I could tell that my father was like not right. That it was like, wait, aren't you meant to be the adult in this situation? I don't think you are. So I was tuned in. I had this belief that children actually are so much more aware than we give them credit for. They might not be able to make sense logically, but their emotional being takes everything in and has an intuitive understanding of what's going on. And so clearly things were going on from one day to the next. I never saw my father again, but there was no explanation. So all there was confusion. I had no idea. My first stepfather was really, really, really wonderful, which I was so grateful, because that, at least, even though he wasn't my true father, my real blood father, I did have the sense that I felt like he was my father. And for the most part, he was amazing. He was really amazing. And I'm so grateful for that period of my life where he was solid. However, in my post, I did share how he spanked me so bad one time, for what could have felt like an hour. Who knows? It might have been 30 seconds, but it felt like a very long time. And it never left me. There's so many things in life where you can go, I forget this and this and this and this. But what I recognize is that trauma, you never forget it. Whether it's a physical trauma, an emotional trauma, even if it's watching a film that is traumatic or violent or scary, it stays in your body and your being forever until you go in and you do the healing work. So I'll never forget that. Then, of course, Then what happened next is we had moved to America, and that was already a huge transition for me. Huge. I had just turned 7. I remember being terrified of moving to America, because the impression that I had, even as a 7-year-old, is that it was really scary. And that there were a lot of guns. And I remember being at my babysitter's house with her parents, and they were watching MacGyver, an episode of MacGyver, and in it somebody had injected poison into an orange. And I just thought, there's no way I can move to America. People poison each other there. So it was a really huge transition for me to move there. I had a lot of fear, and it really came up in my body when we moved there. And I was very, I was a kid that I think was initially shy, but then was very gregarious and playful and cheeky. But I remember it being a real kind of like a cat thrown into a new place, into a new room, and just going, okay, where am I? And if I look back, I see that I learned throughout my life, being in different situations, in different countries, in different environments, that I learned how to adapt very well and very quickly. However, there's always an element of shock or trauma or confusion. There's transition, and especially if it's not held with the clear explanation of this is what's going on. I mean, this is at least what I've chosen to do with my child, is that I'm very communicative with her, because they understand in their own way. And maybe it's just me healing my own wound of having wished that somebody would have just said, hey, this is what's going on, and you're not alone, and you're included, and I'm here for you, and I'm supporting you. Like I always felt very loved by my mother, but I never felt like she talked to me about these things. So I felt very, very alone. So we had moved there. It had been, I think, less than 6 months, or around 6 months. And then literally from one day to the next, my stepfather, who I really loved, disappeared. And I didn't know until a lot later that it wasn't him leaving. It was actually my mom. My mom had kind of fallen out of love with him, and she had kind of been drawn to someone else. But what's interesting for me about that story, and there was another stepfather that came into my life, which I explained in the post, and again, he was kind of relaxed and wonderful. He gave me freedom, but he did end up being very, 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 very close, literally like a hair's thread away from molesting me. Luckily, he pulled his hands off of my body, and as I wrote my post, I felt like there must have been an angel overhead looking after me to just take his hands off my body and just spare me an ounce of innocence. And and then it was like never again, and that was a huge changing point, obviously, in my relationship to him. And eventually down the road, they also separated. But my point, I know I'm just dipping into this very quickly, but my point is that I always had this belief then that came out of that men leave. Men are constantly leaving. They come into my life, they kind of act like they're supportive and loving and like a father figure, and then they leave. And I had to do so much work around this, so much inner child work around feeling abandoned and alone, and that, men are disappointing and men leave. And what's remarkable is the stories that we tell ourselves, because yes, that in part was true for me. However, I never really looked at it from the perspective of like, well, what was my mom's part in this? And what I'm realizing after, thankfully, I have a great relationship with her and I'm able to talk with her, is that she also made her choices, and she left, sometimes for very good reason. Sometimes maybe because she couldn't handle what was in front of her and didn't, maybe in my opinion, choose the best way of extricating herself, However, we're all human. We all have our shit. We all have our coping mechanisms. And it makes the point that, my God, we have to make our patterns and our triggers and our wounds and our fears and our insecurities, we have to make them conscious, because if we don't, we're in reactive mode. And whenever we would just react to something without awareness, it doesn't often go very well, right? Because it's not aware, it's not held with consciousness, where when we're with consciousness with something, we can respond, we can choose how we respond. We are engaged, we're empowered. So where does this leave me talking about shame and vulnerability? I think we all have a story in our life to varying degrees. I have a lot that I could go into. I think me sharing that post and sharing the vulnerability of just my sadness over, feeling like I never had a father, feeling like I don't know what it's like to be held and loved and adored, and safe. Like I don't know, I don't really have that ingrained in my body, in being, and in my belief system that a man is just going to hold me and love me and not leave me. And that I'm important, that I'm insignificant. When you see fathers that, and I'm not talking about the whole kind of daddy's little girl, but like fathers that are just, they love their daughter, they love their child, they're the divine masculine that is like, I'm gonna love you and support you and protect you. And as I said in my post, I had to learn how to hold my back up. Again, I felt so much love from my mom, but that's a different energy, right? I never had the energy of the masculine really holding me. And if anything, I had the imprint of the masculine hurts you. They leave you. They physically abuse you. They betray you. And I think a lot of what's come out of this post is people saying, "Oh yeah, my father was around, but I didn't have a great relationship with him." I've had many clients that it's like they've grown up with their father, but they felt like their father wasn't present. This is becoming a podcast about fathers, isn't it? I think it's the whole how society has defined a man. You can't be emotional, you can't be vulnerable, you have to, be tough and strong and provide for the family. However, it's just, it made men a very kind of robotic version of themselves, whereas I think men are actually incredibly sensitive and emotional, just very have been taught to be very disconnected. And yes, they function differently than women. Their brains are different. However, I do think it's a very cultural conditioning of a very patriarchal cultural conditioning of what a man is supposed to be, and so therefore they couldn't be present emotionally to their partner, to their children. I'm generalizing, but, for the point of the topic, I'll leave it at that. So, what am I trying to say here? So we all have our story, right? We all have trauma. We all have wounding. It doesn't even matter how great our childhood was. There's still shit that happens, or how we perceive life that can create a wound. And it's my personal belief, I might have shared this already before, that our wounding is what makes us human. It's what brings us into our physical form, and it creates this opportunity for transformation, for metamorphosis, for remembering who we truly are on a higher level. And there's nothing like pain and suffering to be the catalyst for that. There's nothing like pain and suffering to, we can either remain asleep to it and then be in pain virtually for our whole life, or we can awaken to it and understand how to actually come towards ourselves with absolute love, unconditional love, and not only heal these aspects of ourselves, which feels amazing, it's such a relief, but to actually really see, maybe for the first time, who we truly are, because we are often behind the veils of our beliefs, of our fears, of who we think we should be, of our lack of self-worth, of our shame. And so we're not really connected to who we truly are. And if we can go on that journey and discover who we are underneath all of these layers of our experiences that we've had in life, which also are the very thing that make us who we are, if we can not reside in shame, which I'll get to in just a second, that process is so empowering, is so beautiful to be able to see that kind of transformation, to feel it, to experience it. And, it's what I love about my job, because I get to witness that, which is just extraordinary. It really feels like an honor. And I've experienced it within myself. And there's such it's just beautiful. It's really, really beautiful. But shame is the thing that really, it's what we don't talk about. And I know Brene Brown has come out a lot, saying that like shame, the best thing you can do for shame is you can talk about it, because shame wants to hide. Shame doesn't want to be talked about. Shame has all of the coping mechanisms and facades to be like, I'm good, I'm great. And what's so fascinating is we have lived, I think it's changing now, but we've lived primarily in a culture that's like, no, you need to be happy and positive and successful all the time. And there's nothing human about that. Even the spiritual communities, like, be positive, just stay positive. And there's nothing about the shadow side of our nature. And to me, it's like, I almost am going beyond the word shadow, because it's just a part of our humanity. Sadness, depression, anger, envy, insecurity, fear, all of these emotions that we define, we judge. It's a judgment in my mind. We judge as bad or negative. And I've always hated the term positive emotions, negative emotions. No, they're just emotions. They're just colors of a color wheel. That's it. And we've kind of exiled this part of our humanity. And then that actually creates even more shame, because it's like, wow, I had these experiences in my life that were hard, that scared me, that made me feel insecure, that made me feel ashamed of who I am, for example. And what's worse than just the pain and the suffering of that is we have been taught that we're not allowed to talk about these things. And that's hugely disempowering, because now not only have we had this experience that was either traumatic or painful that caused us suffering, but we can't feel it within ourselves. So we're neglecting and negating it within ourselves. So there's this part that there's the void, right? Oh, and then it's like, where's the relationship? Where's the man or woman that's going to complete me? Yeah, it's because there's this void inside of ourselves, this little child within ourselves that is desperate to just be held. And we're looking to the external world to do the holding, when we have to do that within ourselves. We have to fill the void because it's from the inside out, because it began from the inside out. Even if it was in reaction to something outside of us, the feeling, the gaping hole is within us. And nothing on the outside can fully fill it, because if it's not filled from the inside out, then, it's just patchwork. It's just a Band-Aid and not really the healing of the core wound. But on top of that, it's like, okay, we can't talk about it. We can't share it. And so the shame comes in of like, well, but I shouldn't feel like that. And vulnerability, for me, I've really found that vulnerability is incredibly empowering. And again, I really tip my hat off to Brene Brown for bringing that into the mainstream, to really redefine what vulnerability is, that it's not weakness, but that it's actually really hugely empowering. And that it goes hand in hand with shame, because if we can just share our experiences are experiences. It's like, I couldn't have made my stepfather nearly molest me. That was never my fucking fault. Excuse my language. That was never my fault. It had nothing to do with my worth. But this is what we do. Something must have been wrong with me, is what we've been taught to tell ourselves. Something must have been wrong with me for me to deserve that. Or we just take the shame because it physically feels so disgusting. What was weird for me is initially, with that experience of being very, and I will say I was molested, because the line had been crossed. It just could have been crossed to a further point that would have really, really been damaging for me. But the point is, I have to own it was already a molestation. And, for several years I was okay. And I don't know why I never chose to tell my mom. I was so strong. I was 15 years old at the time, and I was so kind of used to already being like independent and taking care of myself and just getting on with things. I'd already experienced so much trauma on my own, in my own internal world, that I think I just kind of got on with it. But once I started talking about it, and once I started going to therapy, then it all started to come to the surface, and, to the point where I remember it's like I felt even just uncomfortable being naked or like taking a shower, like never mind any kind of pleasure, right? What would go through my mind in the midst of that. And it was hugely uncomfortable, like really uncomfortable for I don't know, a year or two. But moving through that process is what I was working with a hypnotherapist, and I had this vision of myself being on the ground in child's pose, and there's shattered glass all around me. And I knew immediately when I saw that vision, I knew what it meant. And to me, what it signified for myself, because of course this is coming from my mind, my imagination, my subconscious, is that all the shards of glass represented wounding, pain, suffering, trauma, all of the things that I had experienced in my life that scarred me or that hurt me or that, made me bleed, so to speak, metaphorically. And I knew that they all happened because it was an opportunity for me to have greater compassion and empathy for humans, for humanity, for humankind. Because we all have walked on shards of glass. We've all experienced a version in some shape or form of pain, of suffering, because this is being human. We're not taught that, because like everything on social media, and before it was magazines and television and films and the happily ever after, and even Disney, oh, the prince comes and saves you, and then you live happily ever after. And then all of a sudden in life, real life hits you, and you're like, shit, this isn't like the movies. Even now, it's like, shit, my life doesn't look like everybody else's on Instagram. Yet, because that's not really real. That's just a snapshot that can be filtered and have like glittery stars and make it look all happy. It's like, but life isn't that, right? And we've really got to tell ourselves that that's not life. Life is the day-to-day. Life is the human experience that no image can truly capture until we actually share our story about it. And what has led me to have the courage to be able to share my story or to share the vulnerable aspects of myself is firstly because I've done a shit ton of work to come back home to myself and to really learn how to love and be with myself. And we don't love ourselves because we become perfect. We love ourselves because we accept our entire humanity and our entire experience, and especially the experiences that we felt were shameful, that we have shame around or that we have fear around. When we can learn to love and embrace and accept those parts as a part of ourselves, not to get rid of them. I hear that so much from people that call me for a consultation. How do I get rid of this part of me? How do I fix it? No. How do you include it with love so that you can alchemize it? So that you can heal it and therefore transform it. There is no getting rid of. There is only embracing, loving, transforming through healing. At least that's been my experience, and that's what I've witnessed in more than a decade of doing this work. So, what's allowed me to share is that first and foremost, I feel safe within myself. I feel safe. I feel strong enough. It's not even strong. I want to be careful using that word because we equate strength with toughness. And I want to use it as I'm strong because I can sit and stand and hold my soft spots, my tender wounds. I can hold them, and that's what makes me feel damn strong. It's a very different kind of strength. It's not the armored strength. It's an internal strength that's like, yeah, I'm vulnerable because I'm human. I've learned to embrace my sensitivity, my emotions. I don't judge them anymore. I hold them, I embrace them. I might still move through my shit, I might still have my insecurities, my fears, my, whatever, but I can be with them. And then, there's been a power in sharing because I feel safe within myself. I can share. And then what's so beautiful is to see people be moved or touched by my sharing, by my vulnerability, because it allows them to feel their own vulnerability. It allows them to to hold their own story and trauma without the shame. Because if you can name it, you name it. The shame can't exist. When you go, yeah, this is what happened to me. And I don't have any shame because this is just what happened. I couldn't have asked for it. I didn't do anything to deserve it. It just happened. And with my stepfather that molested me, he, from a higher perspective, from an adult mind, I can see that he was molested as a child. He was abused as a child. And again, as I said in the beginning, if one does not heal their own trauma, they just replicate it. And on a macro level, this is what's going on in the world right now. There is a huge amount of trauma in the world that is needing to be healed right now. It's not just the individual, it's the collective, which is the makeup of all the individuals, but it's also just, us as a humanity, as a collective, as a species. And what's amazing is if we can go through this dark night of the soul, both individually and collectively, the other side is remarkably beautiful because we're free then. We're not confined by our pain, and most especially we're not confined by our shame of our pain. Because I personally would love to see a world, a culture, a society that isn't so obsessed with pretending. Like, why are we pretending to be happy if we're not? Why are we pretending to be younger if we're growing older? Why are we pretending I don't know, there's so, and I'm not saying that with any kind of judgment or blame, but it's been conditioned into us, right? But is it serving us? I don't think so. I don't think so, because actually the rate of depression is through the roof. It's not this message that we need to be perfect is just simply not serving us anymore, because perfection does not equate happiness. Happiness for me has always been, am I at peace with myself? Or am I at war with myself because I'm not accepting of all aspects of myself? So I think we could really do with putting down the facade and the fucking filters and just being like, okay, this is who I am and I'm not ashamed of it. And that's a journey, right? It doesn't happen overnight. It's a journey. It's a process. It requires support. But in my mind, it's really worth it, because if we want to really be free within ourselves, if we really want to feel liberated, we've got to move through the shame and the pain and the suffering and the trauma. The only way out is through, and it's got to be done with a hell of a lot of love. And then really comes the liberation. And my sense is, somebody wrote this, I think it was a comment, and I thought it was just so true, is if everyone dealt with their trauma and really healed, again, not to be perfect, but just to accept being human, our world would look so different. Imagine everyone in power doing that. Oh my God, the world would be different. There are such stupid games being played out because it's coming from greed and control and manipulation and fear, and all of that comes from a lack of self-worth. All of it. So I guess my invitation in sharing this today is just, can we begin to look at the parts of us that maybe we're ashamed of, or we're scared of, or we're still in pain with, or maybe we don't even know because we haven't tapped into them, but would we be willing to look at these parts of ourselves, to have the conversation with ourselves, with someone that we trust, with someone that can guide us, to actually do the work and to heal it, so that we're not having to carry these stories. We're not having to carry the trauma, the pain. Not that there's anything wrong with these things, but if we get stuck in them, we're not free. We're not. We're replaying the same patterns over and over and over again, and we're constantly actually keeping ourselves at bay, at an arm's length away, because we're too scared to come towards the little child within us that is just scared and is just needing a hug. It's really that simple. It's that simple. So I'm just putting the invitation out there that maybe we can start to do the inquiry and to be gentle and kind and loving with ourselves along the way. Okay, thanks for listening. To be continued. Sending you all love from afar.